Welcome to the Promised Land. Often we have dreams of a promised land. If we migrated ourselves or if we're in a transition in life, and then when the dream comes true, we also meet reality. And we will continue with the story from the book of Joshua, from the entrance to the land of Israel, all the way to King Solomon and the building of the first temple in this chapter right now, beginning with Joshua. The time frame, the chronology, differs whether you talk about traditional chronology or what we learn in the course, which is based on a combination of text and archaeology. What we learn in the course is that this period, called the period of the settlement, begins around the year 1200 BCE, the beginning of the 12th century BCE, and ends at 1004 BCE. Iron Age 1 goes all the way there, and then the beginning of Iron Age 2. What happened in 1004 BCE? The conquest of Jerusalem by King David. And then after him, King Solomon, David and Solomon, the 10th century BCE. If we go by the traditional chronology of Judaism, it will be a little different. Based on the 6th chapter of the first book of Kings, and other places too, the period of a settlement will be about 400 years, which is longer than 200. So just that you're aware, and if you're guiding religious Jews that are more inclined to go with a traditional chronology, you need to know that there's a gap in between. So we will begin with the settlement period, the period described in the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and the first book of Samuel. Joshua chapters 1 to 12 introduces us to the nation unified, coming in a conquest into Israel, conquering Jericho, conquering Ai, having these whole series of national events as one nation, 13 tribes, Levites serving in the tabernacle, crossing the Jordan River, all having a massive ceremony of circumcision and memory and celebrating Passover together as a nation in Gilgal, in the Jordan Valley. We mentioned the battle over Jericho, the battle over Ai. Do you remember Ai? Khirbet Atel? We mentioned it with Abraham not too long ago. Coming and fulfilling the commandments of Moses with a blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal, and going to battle against a coalition of kings from the south and a coalition of kings from the north. So all this great war, a list of 31 kings defeated by Israel. This takes place in the first 12 chapters of the book of Joshua. Then the next part of the book will be more scattered. Every tribe will have to take care of itself, inherit their own piece of land that was promised to them. If you read Joshua 15 through 19, you will have all the division of the different tribes of Israel. It's a bit confusing, the numbers here, so I'll repeat them. Jacob had 12 children. Joseph had 2 children too, that are both considered a tribe. Therefore, we have 13 tribes. 12 children, 13 tribes, and 12 pieces of land divided to the 12 tribes. Because one tribe, the tribe of the Levites, does not get their own land because they serve in the tabernacle and later on in the temple, and every tribe will allocate space also for the Levites. So that's just a side issue, but so we're not too confused. So Joshua, generally speaking, is a story of a unified nation coming to settle the land. It ends, chapter 24 of the book of Joshua, with a covenant between the nation of Israel and God in Nablus, in one of the most central cities in Israel, that covenant where in the place where they will also bring the bones of Joseph to be buried in Nablus. The next book, the book of Judges, is very different. The book of Judges is a continuation of the tribes taking care of their own. Each tribe or region of a few tribes will be fighting their own battles. There's a pattern in the book of a sin of a people of Israel, and then bondage, some kind of enslavery or harassments by the neighboring kingdoms. And the people of Israel cry out to God, repent, and then they are redeemed by a leader that comes from a specific tribe and helps a specific tribe or region. None of the judges, which is a kind of a leadership described in this book, but there are different kinds of judges. They don't all judge necessarily. They do all lead the people of Israel and redeem them from an oppressor. Some judges have more verses or chapters dedicated to them, and some only a verse or two. So we won't mention all the judges in the book of Judges. The main ones are Deborah, which you have to know in the context of Jezreel Valley and Mount Tabor, where she led the battle together with Barak, son of Avinoam, against the Canaanites. Again, a specific region. This is only in the north. She has little to do, for example, with the tribe of Judah or Shimon. She sat on the mountain of Ephraim, and she led northern tribes to a battle against their Canaanite oppressor. Gideon, also in the north, the battle of Ein Charod, a very important battle, and again, Jezreel Valley, Mount Tabor. Yiftach has to do with the east bank of the Jordan River, therefore we don't talk a bit about him as much in our tours. And Samson, of course. Samson sits between the tribe of Dan and Judah, and he has nothing to do with the northern tribes. And he fights the Philistines, which sit on the southern coastal plain of Israel. So we see how every judge, every leader here is in a very specific region. The people of Israel are not unified. That is one thing to be said. They are sinful. That is another thing to be said about the story of the book of Judges. And the judges, the leaders, just deteriorate. Deborah and Gideon are good examples of role models, although Deborah was far braver than Gideon, for example, and his sons were already horrible, and I'll let you read all about it. Yiftach also has a very embarrassing background and an embarrassing end to the story. Embarrassing would be an understatement. And Samson is this lone wolf who goes and marries a Philistine. In Timnata, who goes to Gaza to a Philistine prostitute. Yeah, it's all a divine plan so he can take revenge over the Philistines, but he's not exactly a role model, not exactly a judge. Things only deteriorate from chapter to chapter throughout the book, and the end is already horrific. At the end, we find the tribe of Dan. That is where Samson comes from. But they were not able to cope with the Philistines, so they need to find themselves a new piece of land. So they leave a place we call Gush Dan, from the area of Tel Aviv and south on the coastal plain into the lowlands next to the Philistines. They could not quite settle there, so they found a place in what we call Tel Dan today, a place called Laish. On the way, they take a Levite in prison. They take a lot of idols and establish idol worshipping. That is one difficult story. Another difficult story, even far worse because it gets worse and worse, the story of concubine in Giv'ah, a story of rape, murder by the tribe of Benjamin over a guest, which ends up in a civil war where 11 tribes come together to fight against the tribe of Benjamin, which is almost extinct. In other words, we can describe the book of Judges as anarchy. The quote that repeats itself again and again: in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. Anarchy. And the process from the book of Judges into the book of Samuel is the process from anarchy to monarchy. And the man who will be in the middle of this transition, the last judge, will open a new book that will be the prophet Samuel, who's also called a judge. The background to the story of Samuel is the tabernacle in Shiloh, where Eli is the high priest, but not many people come to the tabernacle, to the center. The religious capital of Israel is corrupt. The sons of the high priest are corrupt. And to this context, we have a beautiful story of the birth of Samuel by his mother, who's quite a role model in Judaism, and not only in Judaism, Hannah. And Samuel will grow up in the tabernacle, and he will grow up as the total opposite of the corrupt leadership of the time. Samuel will not care about himself, will only care for the people. Samuel will be leading the people, judging them from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. So for the first time, we have unity. And Samuel will be sent by God against his own will to ordain, to anoint the first two kings. First, he will anoint Saul, son of Kish, and later, after Saul has sinned, he will be the one to anoint David, the son of Ishai, or in English, Jesse. So the first book of Samuel has to do with Saul as a king and with many battles of Israel and the Philistines. The battle of Even-Ezel, the battle of Mitzpah, the battle of Michmas, the battle of Elah Valley, the Gilboa battle that ends the book, the first book of Samuel, where King Saul falls on his own sword and loses his sons and his own life. So those are kind of the geopolitics of the first book of Samuel and of the period of Samuel and King Saul. All this time, the tabernacle was in Shiloh until this first battle of the Philistines, Even-Ezel, where the tabernacle was destroyed. No more tabernacle in Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant is saved in a story that you will probably tell in Tel Bet Shemesh. Coming back just to remember the tabernacle, which was the religious center for the Jewish people, as we mentioned, comes already from Mount Sinai. Speak unto the children of Israel, that they take for me an offering of every man whose heart shall be generous, and let them make a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. So the tabernacle was a religious center, according to Jewish text, for 440 years. But it stops at this time. There's no center really. The ark is well guarded in the area of Abu Ghosh by Elazar the priest. The tabernacle we don't hear about, and we have the prophet Samuel and King Saul. So that will be the case until the death of King Saul at the end of the first book of Samuel. I'm giving time to mentioning what is in which book in order for you to take the time and write a line or two about every book of the Tanakh, because it is the most important book for guiding in Israel, and it's good to know. You talk about Saul, you know it's the first book of Samuel. You talk about David, you know it's the second book of Samuel if he's a king, or if he's just a shepherd, or someone who's fleeing from King Saul, is the first book of Samuel. So every book, write yourself a one-liner, 2 lines, what is the main issue of the book. The Tanakh is our kind of big topic still for the time being and in the next few chapters of the day. Second book of Samuel, as we mentioned, has to do with King David. King David becomes king right after King Saul dies, but then he is king only over Judah in Hebron for 7 years, and he will be king of a united kingdom only 7 years after, 1004 BCE, which is also the time when he conquers Jerusalem and makes Jerusalem his capital, the capital of a united kingdom, and if you want, you can say the eternal capital of Israel from 3,000 years ago. King David will have huge success and victories, but he will also sin. If you read the simple text, other interpretations, rabbinic interpretations, will not accept that it was an actual sin, but if you take the simple text from the 11th chapter of the second book of Samuel, you see the story of David and Bathsheba. And the rest of the book is really a story of crime and punishment. A lot of punishments that his family receives from those events of his sin. Though we're not just talking about the biblical story, but David, we learned before, is also the one who wrote, according to Jewish tradition, not alone, but with following 10 elders of the Jewish nation, the book of Psalms. So whenever we talk about King David, whether it is in the city of David, in the tomb of David, in Elah Valley, in Gedi, always remember, he wrote the book that is not only the most composed book ever, with the most music written to it, but the base for prayer. If all the books of the Bible have to do with descriptions of God and his messages to mankind, the book of Psalms is mankind reaching out to God. And that will be the base for Jewish prayer. It will be a base for a lot of Christian prayer. No matter if the songs will be in Latin or Greek, the word hallelujah from the book of Psalms will repeat in whole psalms that are being sang all over the world. Also in Islam, it says in the Quran specifically that the book of Psalms, called in Arabic Zumul like the Hebrew word Mizmor, is holy and was given to David by God. So a divine book in all 3 religions. You can also see that the traditional tomb of David is a holy place for 3 religions, with a synagogue, the Last Supper room, and a mosque. And touching on Psalms when you talk about King David is very important. You can talk about events, historical events, or you can talk about the spiritual meaning of these events as they are described in the book of Psalms. What does it mean to walk in the valley of darkness and know no fear? These are sentences that every religious person in the world will usually know, identify with. So don't forget to use them, and not only the history and archaeology. King David, when he conquers Jerusalem, he also buys the threshing floor from a man called Aravna the Jebusites. He conquered the city, but north of the city is the threshing floor, and he buys it, purchases it for money. Why? Good question. But we know that in the tradition, that is the place of Mount Moriah. King David wanted to build the temple. in that place that we'll now go to talk a little bit about its significance in the Hebrew Bible and in Jewish tradition. Let's start with a tradition which is not in the Bible. We are reading out of Maimonides from his book Mishneh Torah, which is a book of halacha, of Jewish law. I won't read it all, only what is in bold here. Adam, the first man, offered a sacrifice there and was created at that very spot. As our sages said, man was created from the place where he would find atonement. He would find atonement because that is where the Holy of Holies in the temple will be. Mount Moriah and foundation stone. Foundation stone in the summit of Mount Moriah is considered in Jewish tradition where the world and Adam and Eve were created from. That is the center of the universe. In Latin, there's a term axis mundi. Many cultures have kind of a focal point, a center. And the Jewish focal point is the foundation stone on Mount Moriah, Temple Mount. So one, we said a tradition. This is where the world was created from. Maybe the word wasn't altogether appropriate because according to religion, creation is not something that was and done. Creation, divine grace coming to the world is something that is in present progressive, happening all the time. So divine grace is coming to the world all the time, according to Jewish tradition, from this specific spot on earth. And all the prayers of man to God come up from there. So that is number one. From here we'll be more biblical. In Genesis 22, we already spoke about the binding of Isaac. Land of Moriah, Mount Moriah, we understand that it is the same place called Moriah, the Temple Mount. In the book of Deuteronomy, you remember the last speech of Moses? 21 times will it mention that only to the site that the Lord your God will choose, amidst all your tribes, as is habitation, to establish his name there you are to go. Hamakom asher bo yivchar Adonai leshaken shmo sham. The place that God chooses is this place. And in this place, as we mentioned, King David, purchases the threshing floor of a Jebusite resident called Aravna, Arnan, depends where you read his name. And he wants to build the temple. And he gets an answer. And the answer is no. The answer is brought to him by Nathan, the prophet. I have not dwelt in a house since the day that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even this day, but have walked in a tent, remember the tabernacle, and in a tabernacle. In all places wherein I have walked among the children of Israel, spoke I a word, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? David said, I have a palace, and God will sit in a tent. The Ark of the Covenant sits in a tent. And the reply from God is, it's fine for me. But if you need, for your human needs to relate to God, a glorified temple, which is not the tent that I commanded you to build, the tabernacle, Mount Sinai, you can, but not you, only your son. The book of Chronicles will also give the explanation. Why? Because the hands of David have blood on them. And only hands that do not have blood, that do not know war, can build the temple to the God of Israel. This idea repeats itself in many commandments, rules, also regarding the tabernacle. You cannot have a sword or any iron touch the stones of which you build, the temple, the altar. Even the word of the name of Jerusalem, Shalem, means shalom, peace, and the one who will build it is the son of David, Shlomo. Shlomo, also from the word shalem, also means peace. David will make all the preparations he can, raise funds. He will write psalms dedicated to the temple for the Levites to sing on the ascents, on the steps leading to the temple, greeting all the people coming on pilgrim. Foundation stone, Mount Moriah. That will be, according to the most of the scholars, and some people will say it's a few meters from where the rock of the Dome of the Rock is today, the temple, and this is the place of the Holy of Holies. And that is where King Solomon builds the temple. In the 480th year after the Israelites left the land of Egypt. Remember that? Not long ago in our class, but according to the traditional chronology that you see here, 40 years in the desert leaves us 440 years from Joshua to Solomon. In the month of Ziv, that is the second month, in the fourth year of his reign over Israel, King Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. So we understand this is around 966 BCE, to be completed after 7 years, 959 BCE, the erection of the first temple, the Temple of Solomon. And here's the description from the book of Chronicles. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So if there was any doubt, Moriah, Temple Mount, same name, same place. Binding of Isaac, and the place of the temples, first temple and second temple to be, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place which David has designated at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. All these stories that we mentioned in that one focal point to the Jewish world. And also, after the destruction of the first temple, the second temple will be built in the same place. We're reading out of the book of Ezra. The builders had laid the foundation of a temple of the Lord. Priests and their vestments, with trumpets, and Levites, sons of Asaph, with cymbals, were stations to give praise to the Lord, as King David of Israel had ordained. They sang songs extolling and praising the Lord. For he is good. His steadfast love for Israel is eternal. And we'll come to that historical chapter. So, anyways, we talked about the first temple being built here with the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant. The second temple without the Ark of the Covenant, but the Holy of Holies in the same place. In the same place, which is also the third holiest place in Islam. For according to Islam, from there Muhammad ascended after Isra and Mi'raj, ascended to heavens, met with some of the prophets we just mentioned, like David, Moses, and others, and had a revelation where he got the 5 prayers a day. That is according to Islam, in the Dome of the Rock, but the rock is the same rock, also according to many Muslim sources, the same rock that was in the Holy of Holies of a temple of Solomon and of a second temple. The Dome of the Rock sits exactly in the place where the temple used to sit, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the place where the royal portico used to sit in 2,000 years ago. This place, when it was standing and also after it was destroyed, was a focal point for the Jewish people. Hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple, we can read this from the Babylonian Talmud as a Jewish law that applies until this day, until the 21st century, will apply, and every Jew knows it, whether they come from Africa, India, United States of America. One who stands in prayer in the diaspora should focus his heart and face, we know, towards Israel. One who stands in Israel should focus his heart towards Jerusalem. One who is standing in Jerusalem should focus his heart towards the temple. One who stands in the temple should focus his heart towards the Holy of Holies, which is the foundation stone. Consequently, one standing in prayer in the east turns to face west, and one standing in the west turns to face east. One standing in the south turns to face north. One standing in the north turns to face south. All of the people of Israel find themselves focusing their hearts towards one place, the Holy of Holies in the temple. Just think of the energy every single moment. Hundreds of thousands of Jews praying, giving thanks, wishing, giving praise, and aiming at the same geographical point, which is the center of the world in Jewish tradition. Let's wrap this topic of the sanctity of the Temple Mount in Judaism and give a brief summary. So we said in tradition, it's the place of the creation of the world and man, the navel of the world. And we gave quite a few biblical stories that are directly attached to this point. The binding of Isaac from Genesis 22. The place of divine choice according to the book of Deuteronomy. The threshing floor of Aravna the Jebusite, book of Samuel. The temple of Solomon in the book of Kings, and the place of a second temple in the book of Ezra. There are also more traditions that will connect to this spot, and you're welcome to go and find them. It's very easy to find, but I would expect you to know this by heart in the middle of the night, as this is one of the most important places in Israel, and definitely the most important place in Jewish religion. We opened up this topic of the sanctity of the Temple Mount in the context of King David and Solomon. King Solomon the builder, and came to the significance which is true to Jews until today, of course, and for many more years. And let's come back to the story of King Solomon. King Solomon, who is described as a fantastic king, ruling over the United Kingdom with diplomatic relationships, huge economic success, ruling all the way from Dan in the north to Eilat in the south, having ships, trade with Africa, trade with Lebanon, you name it. But although he's considered the wisest person who ever lived, he too sinned. That is the theological explanation for his son not to be a successor over the entire United Kingdom. The United Kingdom will not continue after King Solomon. It was only for 3 generations: King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. From now on, no more United Kingdom of the 12 tribes. But that is a story that will have to wait until we meet again. So I'll see you later. Welcome back. We're in the 12th chapter of our course, who would believe it? And we talked about the sanctity of Jerusalem, about the United Kingdom of Judea and Israel described in the Tanakh. Of course, in the history class and archaeology class, you went into the argument whether there was a United Kingdom or not, but we're giving here the grand narrative of the Jewish peoplehood, of Jewish tradition, and the more we progress in chronology, the more agreement there is between the different fields of thought. So we will leave the academic argument to the archaeology and history class, which is very important. We are now using the chronology in order to touch base, again, on as many understandings that we can on Jewish tradition, culture, religion, and basic terms. So, from the year 930 BCE, we have a description of a divided kingdom. The kingdom of Judah in the south, and the kingdom of Israel in the north. The kingdom of Israel will not last too long. The kingdom will fall in the hands of a most cruel empire that the world had known until then, in the hands of the Assyrian Empire, that will conquer the Israelite kingdom in 3 different campaigns between the years 733 BCE and 720 BCE. So if a map of Israel prior to this looked like this, and the self-definition of every individual and of every family was tribal, so when the Bible introduces, for example, the father of Samson, it is Manoah the Danish, which means from the tribe of Dan, Manoach Hadani, and Gideon the Menashi, and the Ephrati means from the tribe of Ephraim. Everyone was always introduced by the tribe they came from. That is the identity, the core identity. The nation is something kind of abstract, but everybody knew his specific Israeli culture by the tribe of belonging. But after this campaign, let's choose the year 720 BCE as the end of it. From all this great Israelite kingdom, there's nothing left. There's only the kingdom of Judah. So, if until now everybody would define themselves by the tribe of Simeon and many of the Benjamites were already assimilated into Judah, so now the term Jewish becomes from a name of a tribe to a name of a nation only because it's the only tribe left. This will not be the platform to talk about King Hezekiah that managed to stand against the empire 19 years after the destruction of the northern kingdom. But the kingdom of Judea will continue to tell the Israelite story or the Jewish story, which will now be pretty much the same, because it's the only tribe that continues. Actually, that is not altogether accurate. There's one more tribe that kept its identity. Maybe you even are wearing right now Levi's jeans. Levi's is the family of the Levite. The Levites strictly preserved their identities, and within the Levite tribe, the priesthood family. Kohen, Levi, and Kohen. So if you know the family names, Levi, Kohen, of course, Katz, Kaplan, Chaplain, Azulai, and many others, Kogan. These are all names that preserve this tribal identity and a lot of customs. When there's a Torah reading, there's always a special honor to the priest, to the Kohen, and a special honor to the Levites. When we say the blessing after food, the blessing of the priest in the synagogue, we preserve the tribe of the Levites and the priest. They will not, the priest, Kohanim, will not go into a cemetery because they're supposed to be pure and serve in the temple one day when it will be rebuilt. So all these customs are very strictly preserved for the tribe of the Levites and the Kohanim, which are of course within the tribe of Judah. Many were also exiled with the tribes of Israel. The tribe of Benjamin was between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. So some of the Benjamites will continue with the tribe of Judah. For example, Mordechai from the book of Esther is called Mordechai HaYehudi, Mordechai the Jewish, and now the Jewish is already a name of a nation, as it will be even in the 8th century BCE after this destruction and the exile of the 10 tribes. But he is from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so that was a few words about the term Jewish. That comes from the tribe of Judah, that is the only one that survived, and the tribe of the Levites that also preserved their identity until today. So the kingdom of Judah will continue for over 100 more years until the 6th century BC. Until the next empire comes, the Babylonian Empire, which will destroy the kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem, and the temple. These events, around the year 586 BCE, are very well remembered in the Jewish calendar and Jewish culture. And when I say remembered, how do we remember? You remember by doing things. So again, we're back in the Jewish calendar and in what we do in the Jewish calendar in order to remember these events. The events described in the last chapter of the Book of Kings, the Book of Kings, chapter 25, are events that hold in them 4 out of 6 fast days in the Jewish calendar. So we will eventually know all the 6, but we're going with the Jewish timeline. So we will start with the beginning of a chapter, second Book of Kings, chapter 25. Let's take a minute, press the pause button, bring the good book, and we will read. In the 9th month, in the 10th day, wait a minute, 9th month, where do we count from? Right, from the spring, from the Exodus, from the month of Nisan. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, around December, January. In the 9th month, in the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and his whole army, against Jerusalem and encamped against it. And they built forts against it, round about. So the siege of Jerusalem begins on the 10th of Tevet. The 10th of Tevet is a fast day, from morning to evening. Traditional Jews will not eat or drink from morning to the evening of the 10th of Tevet. Why? Because the siege of Jerusalem, that lasted for years, of starvation, of horrible conditions that are described also in the book of Lamentations, and that will eventually lead to the destruction of Jerusalem, that begins on this day, the 10th of Tevet. See every title, the beginning of the siege on Jerusalem. On top of it being a traditional fast day in Jewish tradition, it has an additional meaning in our times. But in order to explain that, we need to share another context. I will begin with sharing a very important prayer, very significant, called Mourner's Kaddish. When someone loses a family close relation, in the funeral and then in the memorial and in the time of mourning, we have a special prayer that a son will say for a father for a son, brother for brother, sister. The prayer is called Mourner's Kaddish. There are different kinds of Kaddish. This is a specific prayer that it says in the Talmud, it elevates the soul of the person who passed away, and it connects the people here to that person. So it is very meaningful to people who lost family members. And on top of saying it 3 times a day, more, in the period of mourning, every year, at the Yortzeit, at the memorial day for the person who passed away, we say the Kaddish. 6 million Jewish people were murdered. Some of them were murdered with their entire family. So there's nobody left to say Kaddish. And even if there was someone from the family who's left and he wants to say Kaddish for his family, which day were they murdered in? Does he know? Not necessarily. And because of these circumstances, the chief rabbi of Israel, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, who was also dedicating his whole life to try and save Jews at the period of the Shoah, Rabbi Herzog would go to every leader of state and beg for help. He went to meet the Pope and asked him to try and help out. He was very disappointed almost all the time from the answers he got. Even after the Shoah, he was not allowed to get back the Jewish children that found refuge in monasteries, but he was allowed to go to monasteries. And Rabbi Herzog went to monastery by monastery, to every orphanage, into the rooms full of children, and he would cry out, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And if children would respond by mame, tate, it sounded familiar. He understood these are Jewish kids that lost their families and brought them to Israel. That Rabbi Herzog, who was well aware of the problem of memory, of family members who lost their lives, who were murdered in the Holocaust, he decided that the 10th of Tevet will be the general Kaddish Day for the people murdered in the Holocaust. This was made before the National Memorial Day for the Holocaust. So the 10th of Tevet, on top of it being the beginning of the siege on Jerusalem, which we mentioned, is also, in Jewish culture of today, the general Kaddish Day for the people murdered in the Holocaust. We are going back to Second Book of Kings, chapter 25. The siege of Jerusalem lasted for years, but at the end, the Babylonians managed to break through the walls of Jerusalem. That happens, according to Jewish tradition, on the 17th of Tammuz, when the Babylonian army breaks into the city. Then a breach was made in the city, and of course the massacre begins. If we want to read a little further in the chapter, the city was breached. Kasdim, we're called in Hebrew, Chaldeans, which means the Babylonians, were all around the city. And the king set out for the Arabah, tried to escape. But the Chaldeans' troops pursued the king, and they overtook him in the steeps of Jericho, as his entire force left him and scattered. So they capture the king of Judah, the last king of Judah. Remember his name by any chance? Tzidkiah. King Tzidkiah tries to escape. There'll be a later tradition that you can find in the Talmud and in Rashi that he escaped and ended up in Jericho through a huge cave that is under Jerusalem. And he will be telling that story when you visit Tzidkiah's cave right near Damascus Gate. Coming back to the story that you tell in that cave, of course, King Tzidkiah. These are the events of the 17th of Tammuz. Breaking the walls, massacre in the city, and the capturing of King Tzidkiah and this cruel fate that was his end. But that is not the end of Jerusalem. That is the 17th of Tammuz. There's still a fortress inside a fortress. Inside Jerusalem, the temple is still standing. But for 3 weeks, massacres in Jerusalem, and the temple will be closed in more and more until the destruction. These 3 weeks, called in Hebrew Ben HaMetzarim, between the distress of the 17th of Tammuz and the breaking of the walls of a city, and the distress of what is to come, the 9th of Av. In the 3 weeks, we are preparing to the saddest day in the Jewish calendar by refraining from joyful events, no celebrations, no shaving, no meat. You can, of course, bathe for hygienic reasons, but not going to the beach and just the swimming pool. According to custom, some will be very careful the entire 3 weeks, some only in the 9 days towards the 9th of Av, but the 3 weeks between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av are a time where we prepare ourselves towards the saddest day in the religious Jewish calendar. So this is the second kind of period of time that we're talking about. We talked about the Omer counting between Passover and Shavuot, and now we're talking about the 3 weeks between Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, around July, and the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which is usually in August. And that brings us to Tisha B'Av. Continuing in the same chapter, 25th chapter of the second book of Kings, came Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and he burnt the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. The destruction of the temple, burning down of the focal point of the Jewish people, of the first temple, on the 9th of Av, 586 BCE. It is not the only thing that is remembered on that date. 5 events, according to the Mishnah, tractate of Ta'anit, happened on the 9th of Av. Remember the spies and the punishment that the whole generation will not come into Israel? That happened, according to the Mishnah, also on the 9th of Av. And the destruction of the first temple, and the destruction of a second temple at the year 70, and the destruction of Beitar, the last fort to stand against the Romans in the Bar Kokhba revolt at the year 135, and the building of Ilia Capitolina, if we read from the words of the Mishnah, and the city was plowed up, it was flattened, in order to build a Roman city with a grid, with pagan temples over the holy city of the Jews. 5 events that the Mishnah remembers, and they were more afterwards in history, such as the expulsion of Spain, the expulsion of the Jews of Britain, of France, also all happened on the 9th of Av or right next to it. So it's considered a very sad day in Jewish tradition, actually the saddest, representing not only the destruction of the first temple, but so many destructions that the Jewish people have known throughout history. The fast on the 9th of Av is longer and has more prohibitions than the other fast days we learned about. We learned about the 10th of Tevet, around January, and the 17th of Tammuz, around July, which are fast days from morning to evening, no eating and no drinking, 1 prohibition, and about an average 12 hours. Tisha B'Av is 25 hours, just like Yom Kippur, from sunset till the stars are out on the next day, similar to a full Shabbat day or any other holiday. It is 25 hours of fasting, and there are 5 different prohibitions of the fast. No eating and drinking, just like any other fast day, but also no washing or bathing, no application of creams or oils, no wearing of leather shoes, only like sandals, Crocs, or things that are not made out of leather, and no sexual relationships. So 5 different prohibitions that are also common to Tisha B'Av and to Yom Kippur. So fasting about all these events that you can see when you go out touring. Even if you don't tour on Tisha B'Av, since these days are important in the Jewish calendar, if you're talking to Jews, you have to address them. If you talk in Tzedekaiah's cave, you have to mention the 17th of Tammuz. If you go and see the evidence of a destruction of the first temple in the city of David, in the Jewish quarter, mentioned. It's in the 9th, don't just say 586 BCE, say the 9th of Av, because it is a day that carries meaning in Jewish collective memory. There's no place where you can see the 9th of Av, as well as the archaeological park, the Davidson Center, where you actually see the stones that the Romans threw from the top of the Temple Mount in the second temple destruction on the 9th of Av 70. You can also walk through the draining system where Jewish rebels hid from the Romans. And Josephus describes how they killed only in that draining system 2,000 people, that it flowed with blood. These are the events of the 9th of Av that Jerusalem remembers and the Jewish people remember. Many more places can address the different events in the Mishnah and the Tractate of Ta'anit. I only mentioned a few. If you walk around in Tisha B'Av, in the area of Jerusalem, in the Western Wall, you will see also why it is called the Wailing Wall. The term the Wailing Wall is derogatory. It was kind of mocking the Jews that cry at the Western Wall, that shed tears at the Western Wall. If you want to see that, go on the 9th of Av. The Jewish people accepted the term, even with pride. We also call it in Hebrew, Kotel Adma'ot, the wall of tears. For when we cry in the Western Wall, it's not only about Tisha B'Av, 586 BCE, or Tisha B'Av, the year 70. It is about these events representing everything that had gone wrong in the world, that is destroyed, that is just not right, and needs to be fixed in our world. So you can see that on the 9th of Av. People sitting and crying over the destructions that the world has known, that the Jewish people have known. You could see that throughout history. This, for example, is a photo from 1880 of a Western Wall. You see people coming. It's interesting to think what everyone has in mind when he sheds tears on these stones. It's interesting also to see they all left their shoes behind, just like Exodus chapter 3. Take your shoes off, because this place is holy. Wait a minute. The place that is holy was the foundation stone in the middle of a dome of a rock. But in the last 700 years, since this little alley, which was full of garbage many times, right under the Muslim quarter, was the only place close enough that Jews had access to from the Jewish quarter. That's why they came here, to this place, to the Western Wall. So we said one thing this place represents is the destruction of the temple, the remaining wall of a platform that used to hold the temple. And as I said, there's no place where you can see this destruction better than the Davidson Center. But the meaning of a Western Wall is not the Wailing Wall. It's not a wall of tears. It's actually a different meaning. If you go right here, the place of this destruction, you can find a 15 or even 1600-year-old graffiti on the wall, right under the Robinson's Arch. What does this graffiti say? If you were to walk on this pile of rubble, seeing the destruction, seeing the ashes, and it's part of your nation that was destroyed. It's your ancestors that were slaughtered in their own city. What graffiti would you put on the wall? You can ask your tourists too. And then you can open, because this graffiti is a quote. Every first grader Israeli kid can read these letters, 2,000 years, a little less, 1,600 years after they were written. But this is actually a quote from the Bible, from the book of Isaiah, chapter 66, where it says, "Thus said the Lord, I will extend to her," meaning Jerusalem, "prosperity like a stream, the wealth of nation like a wadi in flood, and you shall drink of it. You shall be carried on shoulders and dandled upon knees. As a mother comforts her son, so I will comfort you. You shall find comfort in Jerusalem." And now, the verse that is quoted here in the stone, "Ureitem v'sas levavchem," you shall see and your heart shall rejoice. Your limbs shall flourish like grass. The power of the Lord shall be revealed in behalf of his servants. This is a prophecy that is full of joy and hope. And this is the graffiti that some Jewish person, seeing all the destruction, chiseled into the wall 1,600 years ago. And this is the meaning you'll usually see when you go to the Western Wall. You will see hope. The best time to come to the Western Wall is Friday night, Kabbalat Shabbat, and you will see all kinds of Jews and non-Jews that join, celebrating, dancing, singing, because there is the faith that just as the prophecies of destruction were fulfilled, also the prophecies of rebuilding. And more than the tears it represents, the Western Wall represents great hope and joy of a privilege to come and visit it after 2,000 years of exile to so many Jews from all over the world. And it is one of the most important points for the Jewish people. It's also a very religious site and also a very national site when we come and visit. Although, unlike what we said about Foundation Stone, the tradition of this place as a place of prayer, as a place of gathering, is 700 years old, from the 13th century, from the establishment of the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem. I got a little carried away, for good reason, talked about the Western Wall, right under the Temple Mount, but we were talking about the 9th of Av and its events in the context of 586 BCE, and we came to elaborate about the fast day, the third fast day we learned about today, and we will continue in the chapter. After the massacre, after the huge exile, still a few Jews were left behind. The farmers, the peasants, the simple Jews that would never rebel, that have no leadership, that can still cultivate the land and pay taxes, worthwhile for the Babylonians to leave a few people that cultivate the land. Yogvim v'kolmim, people that have vineyards, people that have farms. And on them, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, puts Gedaliah, son of Achikam, son of Shaphan. Whoever is acquainted with the biblical story know it's an important family, in charge of a people whom he left in the land of Judah. And Gedaliah took the leadership, comforted them, saying, "Do not be afraid, stay in the land, serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well for you. I'll take care of you. Just work, everything will be all right," after this horrible tragedy that our nation just experienced. But Ishmael, son of Netaniah, saw that this Gedaliah, first of all, he's not of royalty, so how come he's the leader? Ishmael is actually is from royalty, and he is cooperating with Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, that just destroyed the temple, that just executed this horrible massacre all around Jerusalem. So Ishmael, son of Netaniah, decides to kill Gedaliah. This happens in a place called Mitzpah. In the 7th month, Ishmael, son of Netanyah, struck down Gedaliah, and he died. I took out a lot of the details, and if you want more details, read in Jeremiah. He gives many more details of how cruel this assassination was. And when the Jews remaining in Judah see what happened now to Gedaliah and to the people who were with him, they flee to Egypt. And that was the last straw. That was the last breaking point of Judah at the end of the First Temple period. And this too is a fast day. The fast of Gedaliah. The 3rd day of Tishrei. A day after Rosh Hashanah. Remember that month of Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur. And Tzom Gedaliah. The fast of Gedaliah, which is the 4th fast day that we learn about in this context of the last chapter of the first prophets, the last chapter of the book of Kings, and the destruction of Jerusalem. It is good that this is not the last chapter of the Bible. It is not the last chapter of the Tanakh. The Tanakh does not end with despair. The Tanakh ends with hope, with the faith that things can be better, will be better. But sometimes you need patience. You need to wait. So we will wait a bit, and we will come back in the next class to how the Bible actually ends, at least the Jewish Bible. We finished our last session with the destruction of the temple, the assassination of Gedaliah, the prophet Jeremiah, the prophet of destruction, and here we are with Ezekiel by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. But both Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, they all had a promise, a prophecy. For thus said the Lord, when the Babylonian 70 years are over, I will take note of you, and I will fulfill to you my promise of favor, to bring you back to this place. The Jewish people on the rivers of Babylon were even ordered by Jeremiah not to mourn all the time, but to live life, to get married, to build homes, to buy fields, to harvest, to make good business, to assimilate into the economical order of Babylon, even a lot of Babylonian culture they will take in, but not religion. And how can we sing God's song on foreign land? That is a serious question, because we do not have a Sunday school in Babylon. We do not have a synagogue. They are not the models of worshiping God without a temple. So there's longing to come back to the land where we have a culture of connection between the nation of Israel and the God of Israel. The assimilation of the Jewish communities was cultural, definitely. We took the writing. Aramaic writing will come into Hebrew, not using more of the ancient Hebrew writing, which we used until now. The name of the months, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, Shvat, Adar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, they are all Akkadian names, some of them even pagan. Personal names, like Esther, Mordechai. Mordechai is a Babylonian name, like Marduk. Zerubbabel, we will meet, Babylonian name. So a lot of cultural assimilation. But apparently they didn't go all the way on the steps of the temple of Marduk in Babylon. Actually, the religious sentiment, the loyalty to the God of Israel and refraining of any pagan gods even became stronger when the Jews were now exiled on the rivers of Babylon. And they were waiting. And as the prophecies describe, the Babylonian Empire will fall at the year 539 in the hands of a next empire. The rising empire is the Persian one. 539 BCE, the Persian Empire, Cyrus, king of Persia, takes over the city of Babylon. And in the next year will be the return to Zion. 538 BCE, the Song of Ascents. When the Lord restores the fortunes of Zion, we see it as in a dream, like a dream come true. Cyrus, king of Persia, allows the Jewish people to come back to Zion. And that is the end of the book of Chronicles. The last word in the Tanakh is Vayal. They came up. From here the word for Jewish immigration to Israel, Aliyah. And in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, so this is 1 year after the Persian Empire defeated Babylon, when the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah was fulfilled, the Lord rose the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realm by word of mouth and in writing as follows. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And anyone of you, of all his people, the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. Permission to the Jewish people to return. 50,000 Jews. Pack up, close their Babylonian businesses, and come back to their ancestral land in Israel, to where their family used to live in. And the first thing they want to do is rebuild the altar, the temple. The Jews returning to Zion, led by Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel. Zerubbabel, son of Shaltiel. You see the Babylonian name here, but he is from the dynasty of kings of Judah, from the dynasty of King David. Yeshua, son of Yotzadak, from the dynasty of Tzadok and Aaron the priest. And these people are leading the people of Israel to resettle the land and to rebuild the altar and the temple on Mount Moriah. And thus says the book of Ezra, chapter 3, when the 7th month arrived, remember that month, the month of Tishrei, high holidays, Sukkot, the Israelites being settled in their towns, the entire people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Yotzadak, and his brother priest, and Zerubbabel, son of Shaltiel, and his brothers set to and build the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings upon it, as it is written in the teachings of Moses, the man of God. And the chapter continues. After dedicating the altar, they are not lazy. They are going to rebuild the second temple. When the builders had laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, priests in their vestments. Remember those verses? It was before that we talked also about this, when we talked about the sanctity of the Temple Mount, the first temple and the second temple that is built here at the year 516 BCE. And they sang songs extolling and praising the Lord, for he is good and steadfast. Love for Israel is eternal. The old men who had seen the first house wept loudly as the sight of the founding of this house. This is already towards the end of the Tanakh, this great joy. The generation that comes and rebuilds, a generation of pioneers, not afraid of all the difficulties. No wall around the city. It is all in ruins. But the first thing they do is rebuild the altar of the temple and the connection between the nation of Israel and the God of Israel. We will continue. It's not yet the end of the Tanakh. We're still in the 6th century BCE. The Tanakh will end in the 5th. But let's have a quick review before we continue of things we talked about. We talked about the books of the prophets. We talked about the order of the books and the main issues of every book. The book of Joshua, with the conquest where the nation is united. The book of Judges, with that cycle of sin, punishment, and then repentance, and judge who saves the region or the tribe. Samuel and the first 2 kings, Saul in the first book of Samuel, and King David in the second book of Samuel, and the book of Kings, starting with a description of King Solomon. First book of Kings takes us all the way through the 9th century to King Ahab, the prophet Elijah, and the second book of Kings starts with the prophet Elijah ascending to heaven and the prophet Elisha replacing him, bringing us from the 9th century all the way to the destruction of the first temple at the 9th of 586 BCE, and even a little bit after with the assassination of Gedaliah. We talked about the prophets of the different periods. Isaiah, which is parallel to the 8th century BCE. King Hezekiah is the most famous king of his time, but Isaiah also served under the father of Isaiah, King Ahaz. Jeremiah, the prophet of a destruction, who prophesied both the destruction and the return after the destruction, and Ezekiel that sits in the rivers of Babylon. Where in the rivers of Babylon? You remembered, Tel Aviv. And then, as we mentioned, the return to Zion, described in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the end of the book of Chronicles also brings us exactly to that point. And we are here, the return is great, but not all the Jews returned. And the next story that has to do with the Jewish calendar has to do with the Persian Empire. And it is the story of Purim, or Purim, and the fast day of Ta'anit Esther. The context is the beginning of the 5th century BCE. The book of Esther starts with saying it's the 7th year of the king Ahasuerus. Who is King Ahasuerus? Most scholars tend to say it is Xerxes. We have documentation of this king, both in Persian documentation and in Greek. So Xerxes is the Greek name, and Herodotus, the historian, wrote about him quite a lot. And in Persian documentation, he is called Chashyeresh, which is very similar to the biblical name Ahasuerus. And the 7th year, so around 479 BCE, the context is the Persian kingdom, the Persian Empire is now getting weaker and weaker, and the Hellenistic, the Greek forces are getting stronger and stronger. In the context, it's a few years, even 9, after the Battle of Marathon. It is right after the Battle of Troy, 300 managing to cope against 3,000 Persian soldiers. So the Persian kingdom is not doing so well, and Ahasuerus is bringing the entire ministry from all the empire for half a year of discussions, of preparations probably to war. And at the end there's a huge feast. At the end of half a year of hard work, a big feast for everybody, and all the citizens of the capital, Shushan, are invited. That is the general background. And the minister, described in the book, Haman, gives the advice of killing all the Jews in order to take vengeance against a specific Jew that would not bow to him, Mordechai. I'm not telling the whole story of the book of Esther. It is important, though, to give a few notes of the celebration, what we celebrate today, and how it relates to the book, and you can easily read it. It's only 10 very short chapters if you want to kind of remember the story, but we'll say a few things that have to do with, again, the Jewish calendar of our times. So first of all, the name, Pur. Purim. Pur means a lottery. Haman and Achashverosh, they did a lottery. When will we execute all the Jews? And the date that happened to fall was the 13th day of the month of Adar, which was pretty lucky because they did the lottery on the month of Nisan, which is the first month in the biblical calendar, and it came to the last month. So there was almost a whole year for the Jews to kind of be saved by the plot of the book of Esther. So Pur means lottery because they just took a note out of a hat saying in which day will we execute all the Jews according to the story of the book of Esther. So moving forward, the story is a story of salvation where the Jews were rescued and eventually the Jews were allowed by the king to take vengeance, to have revenge over those who wanted to kill them. And there was a great battle all over the kingdom and in the capital Shushan. And after the great battle that was a full day in the entire empire and 2 days in the capital Shushan, there was a day of celebrating the victory. And that day where the Jews rested was made by Mordechai as a holiday of memory of a great miracle and salvation. And Mordecai inscribed these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces to make the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of it every year, again a full moon holiday, as the days when the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month that was reversed for them, from grief to joy, and from mourning to a festival day. The day where they were supposed to be massacred was a day where they could revenge against their enemies, be victorious, and celebrate. And they were made as a regular day every year to make them days of feasting and joy and sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor. So we actually have 4 commandments of the holiday of Purim. First, before the holiday, we mentioned there's a fast day called Ta'anit Esther. Esther and Mordechai and all the people of Israel fasted for 3 days when they prayed to God for salvation. So the day before Purim is a fast day, no eating and no drinking from morning to evening, called Ta'anit Esther. So that is one thing. Then we have on the festival itself, on Purim, 4 commandments. One is to read the story, to read the book of Esther. That is a commandment that we do in the synagogues. The community comes together and it's a huge event, and there's a custom of kind of making a lot of noise every time we say the name of Haman in the wish to erase his name from all the memories. Yimach Shimo, we say in Hebrew, the man who wanted to kill all the Jews in the Persian Empire. So that is also a lot of fun, of course, for children, and again, an event that brings together the entire community and family. So that is reading the Megillah. That is one commandment of the holiday. Another commandment in the homes, family event of a feast, a festive lunch on the day of the holiday. Megillah reading is both in the evening, as the holiday comes in after sunset, and in the morning, and during the day there is a festive lunch. And 2 more commandments that we see here. One is sending portions to one another, to friends. It is called Mishloach Manot, where you take 2 portions of food, it says portions in plural, and give them to your friend, one another, which is in the public sphere, and you'll see it in every workplace, school, between friends, between family, bringing to each other these portions of food, which is a very beautiful way to celebrate and celebrate together as a community, not only every family to its own. And gifts to the poor. That is a commandment that will usually be very private. We don't want to show off. We don't want the poor person to know who gave him. You don't need to make a big deal out of it, but giving gifts to the poor, tzedakah, I think it's called in Hebrew, matanot la'evyonim. So that is the fourth commandment of Purim. There are also customs that developed later on. One custom is to get drunk. That is based on a statement in the Talmud that was never accepted and even was rejected in that page in the Talmud, but it became a very popular custom. In the Talmud it says a man should get drunk until he can't distinguish between the wicked Haman and the righteous Mordechai. And many people you will see will get drunk at the festive lunch of Purim. There's also a lot of alcohol many times, and then the end of the day, the afternoon, you may see in a few neighborhoods many drunk people. And from the Middle Ages, a custom of getting costumes, of getting dressed up. And that is probably a Christian influence, starting in Venice. In Venice, there's a very famous style called Commedia dell'arte, of dressing up during the carnival. The carnival is exactly 40 days before Easter. Before Easter, there's a period of 40 days called Lent in Christianity, and before Lent, you want to get rid of all your meat, because you don't eat meat during the Lent. Meat in Latin, carne. So the carnival is a huge celebration of a big barbecue, basically, and with a lot of course, dancing and celebrations and costumes. And it just so happens that the carnival is always around Purim, which is also a month before Passover. So Jews could celebrate with costumes, and it actually could really fit the holiday. Therefore, this custom, which could have been a local custom that would just pass, did become more and more popular, because it was adapted, you can say converted, into Judaism. As the book of Esther has a lot of hiding in the book. Esther hides her identity. Even Hester in Hebrew means hiding. If you spell it with a hey instead of an aleph. So God is hidden in the book. He's not mentioned even once, but you always feel him kind of pulling the strings. So there's a lot of hiding and then showing the real you. In the story, a lot of reversing. Things are reversed, and that's a concept of the holiday. What seemed to be a horrible event, and we see it here in this slide, seemed to be grief, and it became joy. There was a plan of Haman to hang Mordechai on a tree, and it ended up to be Haman hanged on the tree. So things are kind of flipping, reversing themselves throughout the story, and the idea of a person being able to kind of change himself and hide himself has a lot to do with the story, with the basic story of the book of Esther, and therefore was well accepted also as a Jewish custom that you will see in Israel for many children. That idea of getting dressed up became to be the main issue of the holiday of Purim. If we put the Purim story in a historical context of the beginning of the 5th century, so it's not much later, that we have another wave of immigration to Judah, back to Zion. The last wave, if you remember, was led by Zerubbabel, son of Shaltiel, Yeshua, son of Yotzadak. They were the ones who came as pioneers, 50,000 people, and rebuilt the altar and the temple. This is the second wave, 7,000 people, led by Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE. Ezra
reforms a lot of a religious behavior of a second generation. It is not the generation of pioneers. It is a generation that went away from a lot of a vision that their ancestors who returned to Zion had, and Ezra made sure he will fix it as much as he could. He was a scribe, he was a man of a book, a man of a Torah, and he gathered everybody, read the Torah to them in the Watergate in Jerusalem. It's definitely something we can also talk about in the city of David. And he will be joined by Nehemiah, who will also rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They together will enforce the Judaism on the Jews, the marriage that will not be with foreign women but within the Jewish community, and something we mentioned earlier. Earlier, in the first time we met, we mentioned that Ezra, the scribe, in the Persian period, beginning of the Second Temple period, he is the one that adds to the Torah reading on Shabbat, also Torah readings on the market days, on Mondays and Thursdays. And these are the days that we read the Torah until today, Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat. So if you're guiding in the Old City in Jerusalem on Monday or Thursday, you better have a loudspeaker or some kind of headset, because it's going to be very, very loud. All the bar mitzvah ceremonies that are going on with drums and music and singing and coming from all the corners of a Jewish quarter to the Western Wall to celebrate, they celebrate on these days, because these are the days when the bar mitzvah boy can come and read from the Torah. So you see how a lot of the things that Ezra did back then, at the end of biblical times, affect us until this day. And I just said the end of biblical times, at least in the Jewish perspective. Ezra and Nehemiah, the 5th century BCE, that is the end of the period that is described by the Tanakh. The Tanakh begins with Genesis in its description, creation of the world, creation of man, and continues all the way to the Persian period, to the 5th century BCE. And we find in quite a few places that the sages teach that after the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, after they died, the divine spirit of prophetic revelation departed from people, from Israel, and we have no more revelations that are in the same scale as biblical revelations to mankind. So this period, these prophets and Ezra and Nehemiah, who live at the beginning of a Second Temple period, close the period that is described by the Tanakh, by the Hebrew Bible. From now on, everything will be post-biblical, post-revelation. And we will move on to speak about the evolution of culture after prophecy in our next class.